Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
We start with the long-awaited parliamentary report into allegations of Russian interference in British public life. The report accuses the government and the intelligence services of failing to investigate the nature of the threat and how, for example, it might have affected the 2016 EU referendum. The findings by the Intelligence and Security Select Committee say that ministers and officials were playing catch-up despite suggestions of interference in the previous referendum on Scottish independence back in 2014. Downing Street denied it had badly underestimated the threat from Russia. Our first report this evening is by our political editor, Laura Kuensberg.
Here we go.
9 months overdue, after years of suspicion. Finally, in black and white, Parliament's independent verdict on how Russia threatens the UK. But rather than explosive new facts, a different finding.
Shocking. The outrage, astonishing.
There was reason to fear Russia might meddle in the biggest decision in decades, the EU referendum. But evidence of that, the government didn't seek and didn't find.
The UK government have actively avoided looking for evidence that Russia interfered. We were told that they hadn't seen any evidence, but that is meaningless if they hadn't looked for it. The committee found it astonishing that no one in government had sought beforehand to protect the referendum from such attempts or investigated afterwards what attempts to influence it there may have been.
The outrage isn't that there was interference. The outrage is that no one has wanted to know if there was interference. Successive governments have welcomed Russian oligarchs and their money with open arms. And there is a lot of Russians with very close links to Putin who are now very well integrated into both UK business, political and social scene.
Is it your belief that the government deliberately looked the other way? Or do you think that they simply dropped the ball in terms of looking for political interference? And who do you hold responsible?
I wouldn't want to say that the UK government deliberately avoided asking the questions, but nevertheless they did avoid asking the questions.
The security and defence, I think, of not only our democracy but our people should be the first role of government. The government here have clearly let us down.
MPs say there's reason to believe Russia tried to interfere in the vote on Scottish independence in 2014, but there wasn't the capability or the curiosity to monitor interference in the EU referendum. As successive prime ministers tried to manage the awkward diplomatic dance, oligarchs are accused of trying to buy influence in London. The committee also claims Number 10 misled the public when they said there wasn't time to complete all the checks and process around the report before last year's election.
Are you saying he's lied about why it should be published?
I know there's a new thing that if Number 10 says something, it's got to be true. Unfortunately, on this occasion, it clearly wasn't.
Dominic Grieve, who wrote the report, no friend of the Prime Minister, believes we all had a right to know before December's vote.
We highlighted some of the things which Russia had been doing in elections, both here and abroad. And I think that alerting people to that is part of the democratic process and something that they should have been made aware of.
Number 10's adamant they did nothing wrong and the EU referendum was fair.
Did Russia interfere?
And the Foreign Secretary, with his American counterpart today, rejected the committee's claims.
Russia is a top national security priority. We call out Russia when it's necessary. We've shown that we are not for a second complacent about the threat Russia poses when it comes to cyber.
Labour's echoing the committee's call to investigate now what went before.
The report is quite damning. It paints a very bad picture of a government that was far too slow to wake up to the threat posed by Russia towards our democracy, far too slow to take the actions required.
Well, good morning, everybody.
Yet as Cabinet met in person, spaced out today, in the gilded caverns of the Foreign Office, it was clear the government wants to move on, with little desire to dwell on this awkward subject. Laura Kuensberg, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, today's report by the Commons Intelligence and Security Committee described Russian influence in the UK as the new normal and said successive governments had welcomed rich oligarchs with open arms without asking too many questions about the source of their wealth. Our security correspondent Gordon Carrera has more details.
Today's report says the UK is one of Russia's top intelligence targets, but questions whether the country is equipped to respond. The report details Russia's aggressive use of spying, especially in cyberspace, stealing information and government secrets. It points to its use of assassination, going after Russians abroad like Sergei Skripal, poisoned with nerve agent in Salisbury in 2018. And most significantly, it points to a long-running campaign of political interference run out of Moscow, meddling in events around the world. This Russian campaign is the new normal, we were told today. But the report also says the UK has been slow to respond. It is tough on Britain's spies, saying they treated the task of defending the democratic system like a hot potato, with no one wanting to take charge amid competing demands like stopping terrorist attacks. But the real criticism is for government, for failing to give the spies clear direction, and as well as not investigating recent events like the Brexit referendum. The report also says there was a longer-term problem of not seeing the challenge from Moscow. The killing of Alexander Litvinenko in London using radioactive polonium 14 years ago was a clear indication of the threat from Moscow, the committee said. But Alexander Litvinenko's widow told me that successive governments had failed to respond. Do you feel that Britain failed to learn the lesson of what happened to your husband in 2006?
Unfortunately, I would like to say yes. And because it was not strong reaction after that, we received Salisbury. Now we're discussing about hacking and attacks to try to get a vaccine from British scientists.
Why has there not been a tougher line? The committee says it's because Russian money has been allowed to seep into public life, and that's bought Moscow influence, according to one of the witnesses who gave evidence to the committee.
There's a lot of Russian money sloshing around London, and it creates an enormous conflict of interest. And that conflict of interest creates political pressure. And I think the reason why things haven't been done is because there's too many people who are feeding at the trough.
There had been speculation that one former Russian official, now a British citizen, who's given more than £1 million to Conservatives, might be named in the report. But he was not. And he told me there was a Russian threat, but it's about more than money.
It's not a report about me. It's a report about us. Because they are really threat. Russian threat exists. That's absolutely. As my point is that what is the most serious threat is cyber attack.
Today's report may not have provided the evidence of successful Russian interference that some expected, but it has raised serious questions as to whether the British state has the tools and desire to confront Moscow. Gordon Carrera, BBC News.
Well, in a moment, we'll be at Westminster and we'll talk to Laura Ginsberg, our political editor. First, we're going to go to Moscow and our correspondent, Steve Rosenberg. Steve, is there any sign that the officials and politicians in Moscow are taking this report seriously?
Well, today Moscow did what Moscow usually does in this kind of situation. Whenever it's accused of something by the West, it batted everything away. So the Russian Foreign Ministry dismissed the Russia report as Russophobia and a fake. And the Kremlin said, well, we've never interfered in any election, not in America or Britain or in any country. So denial, and that's become a feature of Vladimir Putin's Kremlin. But I suspect that privately, the Russians are pretty pleased with this report because they're the ones who come out of it looking strong. I mean, the report described Russia as an accomplished adversary, a highly capable cyber actor. In contrast, it's the British intelligence community and the political elites and the professional elites that look weak in the face of the Russian threat and in some cases Russian money. So will Vladimir Putin be quaking in his boots at this report? I don't think so. I think more likely the Kremlin will see it as proof that Russia's tactics, methods are working.
Steve, many thanks. Let's go to Downing Street and or to Westminster and talk to Laura there. Is this likely to lead to any kind of action in government, Laura, this report?
Well, Hugh, the government is very reluctant to do anything about it. They don't want to stir up what may or may not have happened in the referendum campaign. But, you know, committees like this one, a serious group, the Intelligence and Security Committee, don't use words like outrage or scandal or astonishing lightly. And I think just as much as the government might want to stick its fingers in its ears about this report, their opponents will in turn keep clamouring for an investigation of what may or may not have happened in the referendum. And I don't think those calls will go away quickly. More broadly, though, we have seen in the last few years, partly in response to the terrible Novichok attack in Salisbury, and also just last week, Russia accused of trying to steal coronavirus vaccine research, a stiffening in the UK's attitude to Russia. The Foreign Secretary was very adamant today that they will always call Russia out when, as a government, they see fit. But I think for a long time there was a feeling around here, many politicians wanted to be very optimistic, a bit like our relationship with China, that Russia was on a path to reform. They were a country that the UK could become more friendly with. But recent events have changed that attitude and have suggested that many of those hopes may just have been misplaced.
Laura, many thanks again at Westminster, and Steve Rosenberg in Moscow, thanks too.
No one is protecting Britain's democratic processes from interference by the Russian state. That's the verdict of MPs on the parliamentary committee that oversees the work of Britain's spy agencies. Their judgment was revealed in a long-awaited report on Russia's attempts to influence elections in Britain. The committee accused the government of ignoring claims that Russia tried to interfere in both the Scottish and Brexit referendums. And they said the influence of a wealthy Russian elite on the UK's public life was now a new normal. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, has this report.
It's a claim that has haunted the Leave victory. These spoof posters sprang up in London 2 years after the event. The allegation that Russian money bought victory in the EU referendum. The Cross-Party Intelligence and Security Committee launched an investigation into that and other claims of Russian influence on politics here. They went deep into the intelligence services to get the answers, and to their amazement discovered the cupboard was bare.
The report reveals that no one in government knew if Russia interfered in or sought to influence the referendum because they did not want to know. The UK government have actively avoided looking for evidence that Russia interfered.
We categorically reject that. I think if you look, we've got a long period recognising the enduring and significant threat posed by Russia to the UK.
The committee reports that the intelligence services didn't want to go anywhere near that kind of investigation, worried that it might look like they were dabbling in politics. Ministers could have instructed them to investigate, but nothing like that actually happened. Contrast with America, where, when allegations of Russian interference in the US presidential elections 4 years ago happened, they were quickly investigated and reported on. Here, by comparison, the rumours first surfaced of Russian involvement in politics in the Scottish referendum 6 years ago. But since then, nothing's happened.
So the question is who is protecting the British public from interference in our democratic process? Well, in a nutshell, we found no one is.
Just as the committee were publishing their report, the government published its response. Some of the committee convinced that timing was a snub. And in that response, the government says there's no need for a look back on what happened in the EU referendum because, it says, we have seen no evidence of successful interference in the EU referendum.
The government cannot say there's nothing to see if they haven't asked to see what's there.
Well, that's what they've just done.
They may have done it today. The public won't buy it.
The Brexit Party leader Nigel Farage tweeted triumphantly, "There's no evidence of Russian involvement with Leave.eu or me in the referendum. It was all a hoax. Apologies are now required."
Well, that's not true, because no one's looked. That's the fundamental point. So no, I'm sorry, that's just nonsense.
Nothing propinquous like propinquity.
The Prime Minister hosted the first face-to-face meeting of Cabinet for 4 months. It was held in the Foreign Office to help ministers keep their distance. The committee accused the government of lying repeatedly in its arguments for not publishing their report, first handed over to Number 10 last October.
This committee has been subjected to unprecedented delay and dislocation. This really must never happen again.
The report also talks of Russian cyber attacks and influence now flowing through all veins of British public life, including the House of Lords. It describes London as a laundromat for illicit Russian money. Moscow dismissed the claims, but deep down may relish today's headlines.
We have seen on the one hand the official spokesperson from the Foreign Ministry saying this is just a Russophobic tissue of lies, because after all there isn't much evidence behind it that's been presented in this redacted version. And at the same time, you've also got, particularly in social media and so forth in Russia, a degree of satisfaction that this has shown that they are still a great superpower, even if it's a superpower of mayhem and malign influence.
The Intelligence Committee couldn't produce specific claims to fire up their demands for an investigation into Russian political interference. He's hoping that helps him make sure no such thing ever happens.
Well, Dominic Grieve was chair of the Intelligence and Security Committee when the report was written, and he joins me now. If you weren't able to see evidence of Russian interference because nobody ever asked the security services to look for it, how do you know there's anything to look for?
I can't answer that question. What I can say is my own committee can't carry out that investigation. The question is, has there been an inquiry into the possibility of Russian interference in the 2016 referendum? And what are its conclusions? Well, the answer is there's been no such inquiry. So in those circumstances, we can't draw a conclusion one way or the other. Do bear in mind, this inquiry wasn't just about the 2016 referendum or indeed interference in electoral processes generally. It was about Russia's threat to the United Kingdom in its widest sense, of which there is plenty of evidence, which we were able to put into our report, ranging from commission of murder in the United Kingdom to interference with the internet and destructive interference as well as hacking. So all those things are there. But on that specific issue, we were surprised to note that there had been no investigation. And indeed, on the face of it, there had been no special measures taken at the time of the referendum to try to make sure that no such interference took place.
Well, I mean, Downing Street have dismissed an awful lot of the findings in the report already. You know, do you accept that they are acting with the nation's best interests when they respond to your reports?
They should be acting in the nation's best interest, but I can't escape the fact that they suppressed this report for 9 months for reasons which were completely and totally invalid and gave a series of explanations as to why they'd done it, which were untrue. So that does worry me. I've expressed my mystification in the past as to why they've behaved in this fashion, and I don't know the answer. But it should be a matter of concern that a government behaves like that towards a cross-party committee, which, if I may say so, included people of different political views, including over the question of leaving or remaining in the EU. That's a complete red herring. We're there to try to make sure that the UK remains secure, including our democratic processes, which is the right of people to determine, without interference by subversion from abroad, whether they want or don't want something, including political parties or staying or leaving the EU.
But in the press conference today, and in a lot of the sort of discussion around this, there has been the assumption that Russia is trying to interfere in our democratic processes and did, therefore must have done, with regard to Brexit. Is that an assumption that you go along with, because we know that things happened in America, the suspicion is things happened over the Scottish referendum, and therefore there's no reason to think that they wouldn't have tried to influence Brexit?
Well, the government has just confirmed it, and I should make clear, we haven't been able to investigate it. I'm no longer the chair of the committee, but it's the government's own view that that happened over the 2019 general election. The evidence of Russian doing this against other states is very well established. But I agree, it's possible it didn't happen in certain contexts in the UK. But as I say, without an inquiry into whether it happened or not, we can't answer that question.
So why do you think it wasn't
happening?
happening?
Clearly poses a threat in a number of ways. That should matter.
I mean,
Sorry.
why do you think both the intelligence services didn't look themselves and politicians didn't direct them to look at this specifically? I mean,
I think if you look at our report, we make quite clear that the idea of interference by using the internet in democratic processes like referendums was not thought about at the time of the 26 referendum. So to that extent, I think the eye was off the ball. People hadn't focused on it. They were looking at other priorities. Subsequently, when the evidence emerged, particularly after the American elections, then in those circumstances, I think it should have been a priority to review what had happened, and that has not occurred. And as I say, it hasn't occurred possibly because there's a delicacy on the part of the agencies, which is something I rather respect about not getting embroiled in domestic political events. But at the same time, on a cross-party basis, the UK government and the opposition parties should be very concerned about this and should have looked into it.
Just
and
briefly,
asked for it to be looked into.
You did also mention the Russian money that's in Britain now and all the oligarchs that have been welcomed over the years and the networks that surround them. Are you basically saying that there are a load of Russian agents living in Britain right now, thriving?
We are undoubtedly saying that there are Russians living in the United Kingdom today who have a great deal of money, who will be using that money in order to further the aims of the Putin regime, on whom they are ultimately entirely dependent if they are to survive economically, unless they have entirely broken their ties with Russia itself.
Dominic Grieve, thank you very much.
Well, today's Russia report has coincided with a separate investigation by other MPs, which says the government must urgently bring in new laws to deal with misleading and harmful content online. Our political correspondent Liz Bates is in the newsroom. Liz.
Yes, so the Culture Committee has looked into this problem of misinformation online before. Now, what's interesting, given everything that's gone on today, is that they've previously raised concerns when they've looked at this around Russian interference with UK elections via social media. Now, that's an ongoing concern for this committee. Today, though, they have focused solely on the last few months and the role of misinformation during COVID-19. Now, this ranges from things like 5G conspiracy theories, as many people will have seen and heard about, through to false reports of hospitals being overcrowded and unsafe, reports that have at times prevented people from going to hospitals, even when they've been very unwell. Now, the committee also looked into the future harms that this problem could cause. So, for example, they think that people who might have read a lot of misinformation online could then refuse a COVID-19 vaccine when one is eventually offered. Now, given all of this, given the findings of this report, the committee has been very critical of the government. They have said that they've raised this issue with them many times in many different contexts and that they simply haven't acted quickly enough to tackle it. Has the government been dragging its feet on this issue?
Yes, I think it has. I mean, they said just a few months ago that they were minded to make Ofcom a online harms regulator. Well, just make them the regulator. Everyone knows it's going to happen, even Ofcom themselves preparing for it. So this is just further delay. And we've been promised a world-leading architecture for social media regulation, something that basically will be held as an example in all the other Western countries. Well, we haven't got there yet, have we? And we're seeing other countries beginning to actually steal a march on us in that respect. So we need to get a move on here.
Now, they've also levelled a lot of criticism at the social media firms, the big tech companies themselves. They say not only have they allowed a lot of this stuff to spread, but they have also at times profited from its proliferation. Now, we have approached some of those big companies, Twitter and Facebook, to come on the programme to talk about this issue, to explain what they've been doing to tackle it. Instead, they've sent us statements. They say that they have invested heavily in addressing misinformation online. They say they've worked with governments and that every day they remove huge amounts of misinformation from their sites.
Liz Bates.
So here is a question. What is worse than knowing that the Russians did interfere in the Brexit vote 4 years ago? The answer, according to a committee of MPs today, is not knowing, because the government and the security services just did not bother to investigate. That was despite suspicions being raised as a result of the Scottish independence referendum in 2014 and the American election 2 years later. One MP on the committee went as far as to accuse the government of actively avoiding claims of Russian meddling. Nobody wanted to touch the issue with a 10-foot pole, he said. So a report that could have placed the focus firmly on the Russian government has ended up embarrassing ours as well. It denied later in a 20-page rebuttal that it had underestimated the Russian threat.
Has Russia been running a campaign to try and influence several here? Today we were told our government has avoided the answer. Parliament's Intelligence and Security Committee has waited 9 months for this moment, but allowed no further delay in warning Russia's disrupting our democracy.
Let me start by saying that the UK is one of Russia's top Western intelligence targets. We know that Russia targets the UK, and not just to steal secrets or research. It suits Russia if there is disunity in the West. It weaponises information.
Their long-anticipated report found evidence of Russia trying to interfere in the Scottish referendum in 2014 and warns of a London laundromat with Russian money used to buy influence among the elite, with several members of the House of Lords working for Russian businesses. But the most damning conclusion of all was that they couldn't reach one about Russia meddling in the EU referendum.
No one in government knew if Russia interfered in or sought to influence the referendum because they did not want to know. The UK government have actively avoided looking for evidence that Russia interfered.
Do you believe that the government has been reluctant to look at Russian interference in the Brexit referendum because the government is run by the winning side?
Democracy is a very precious thing, which I think the report refers to. We need to do what we can to protect it, and the government has not done that. Why ministers chose not to do that, that's one you've got to address to them.
Journalists have been trying to.
Did Russia interfere?
But the government insists there's no evidence and no need for a fresh inquiry.
We call out Russia when it's necessary. We've shown that in relation to the cyber attacks on research and development facilities in the US, the UK and Canada. We've done that together with our partners, and we are not for a second complacent about the threat Russia poses when it comes to cyber.
Ambassador, if you'd like to take a seat, thank you. And if there are further secrets, tonight Russia is not revealing them. Can you categorically deny any Russian interference in British democracy over the past few years?
In the democracy itself, depending what do you mean the democracy, on the official level, I can categorically deny interferences in the British democracy. We have no interest in interference.
But not on any other level? There might have been interference at another level, is that what you're saying?
No, it might be, of course, on some unofficial, some groups of interest, but this officially, linking them with the Russian government, it will be nonsense. Russian government does not do anything like that.
But tonight, Britain can't reach its own answer. When it comes to investigating Russian intervention, our government's accused of not interfering enough. Paul Brand, News at 10, Westminster.
The MP's report said possible Russian interference in UK politics was treated like a hot potato. No one wanted to get a grip on it. So why didn't they? There was plenty to look into. Perhaps it was the money and the influence many Russians have and their closeness to some in power, as the report put it. Russians with links to President Putin are well integrated into the UK business, political and social scene.
The lives of wealthy Muscovites in London. But this is Russian TV comedy, a detective agency which helps oligarchs solve problems in their new home country.
Londongrad, новая серия.
Londongrad is both make-believe and real life, because it's also the name used in today's report to describe the way Russians with close links to Putin were welcomed by Britain, how they've integrated into British business and British politics, and how influence has bred interference.
There is this fusion between the interests of Russian business and Russian intelligence, and it's very difficult to see where the two lines meet. That their interests are now very blurred.
Russia's alleged aggression should surprise no one. In 2006, Alexander Litvinenko, a former spy, was poisoned in London. Evidence perhaps that as intelligence agencies focused on homegrown terrorists in the aftermath of 7/7, hostile states posed a threat too. It was 12 years until the Salisbury poisonings. But during the years in between, Moscow's espionage armory appeared to grow. Prime ministers talked tough and looked it, but they knew that Twitter bots and hackers were a threat, not just military-grade nerve agents.
But it was mainly focused on preventing the Russians sort of directly interfering in the mechanics of that election, rather than what in fact they appear to have been doing, which is using false social media accounts to amplify messages.
Today's report describes the issue of taking responsibility for Russian aggression. It has been surprisingly difficult, it reads, to establish who has responsibility for what. Overall, the issue of defending the UK's democratic processes and discourse has appeared to be something of a hot potato, it says. MI5 is one of the organisations tasked with dealing with hostile states, but it provided only 6 lines of text when the inquiry asked for written evidence on Russia and the Brexit referendum. Culturally, it's reluctant to get involved in politics, but a contributor to the inquiry believes it has questions to answer.
I think MI5 is particularly open to criticism here because it is, as they say, self-tasking. It decides its own priorities based on how it sees the threat.
But the criticism is primarily of ministers and not spies, about whether they had the interests and the ambitions, whether they provided the tools needed to fight interference. Rohit Khatru, News at 10.
And Paul joins me to talk about all this. Look, this is a report, I guess you could say, is more notable by what's not in it than what is, and the MPs make that point. But how worried in the round do you think we should be?
Well, look, Tom, I think a lot of people in Westminster were hanging on for the contents of this report. And as you say, the most interesting and perhaps the most concerning thing was its one big omission, the fact that the committee couldn't draw any link between Russia and the Brexit referendum because, quite frankly, the government had not looked into that threat. And that criticism stretches back beyond Boris Johnson. It includes Theresa May, it includes David Cameron. Tonight, inevitably, it's reignited the Brexit debate on both sides of the argument. In one strange way, it's also sort of settled it because, quite frankly, there will be no further investigation. There will be no further inquiry. The government's been clear on all of that. And the report doesn't really provide many extra pointers to what's already out there about Russian bots, as you've been hearing in Rohit's report about the influence of Russian media like Russia Today. I think what will change is the level of scrutiny of a different type of influence, namely the type that you can buy, the amount of Russian money flowing into the country, donations to political parties, paid jobs for members of the House of Lords with Russian businesses. You can easily see a slew of stories now emerging about those relationships. But for those hoping this report would contain answers, I'm afraid it only tells us to keep going in search of them.
OK, Paul, thank you very much indeed.
Why wasn't there more curiosity, more desire to find out what happened? Of all the questions the Russia report raises, perhaps that one is paramount. It paints a picture of successive governments who actively avoided investigating Russian interference and asks whether the British public has been let down by such a basic lack of due diligence. The Intelligence and Security Committee called for an inquiry into Russian meddling in the Brexit referendum, a call instantly rejected by the government. In truth, there is no smoking gun in this report. Much has been redacted and may not be clearer until subsequent publications. But the overwhelming rebuke to those in intelligence services, Whitehall and elected politicians of all stripes is one of negligence, a failure to question, the turning of a blind eye, and, in sharp contrast, the investigation launched in the US, a willing acceptance not to know. We'll hear from the key players in a moment. First, this report from our diplomatic editor, Mark Urban.
Today, at last, it was published in Westminster, but the report was written 1 year ago and stopped taking evidence 18 months back. It's the product of the Intelligence and Security Committee, but Dominic Grieve was more its architect than any other individual, and the government's decision to prevent publication before the last election still puzzles him.
They have never given a credible explanation as to why they held it up. I think it should have been published in early November. Obviously, if it had been published, it would have attracted some attention, but seeing we were about to embark on a major democratic event, namely an election, where we in fact now know from the government itself that the Russians sought to interfere with it, seems to me it was very much in the public interest that they should have this information.
The committee revealed its consternation that the intelligence agencies simply didn't go looking for Russian interference at the time of the 2016 Brexit referendum or 2017 general election.
We know that Russia targets the UK, and not just to steal secrets or research. It suits Russia if there is disunity in the West.
What we do know about Russian influence in the UK is that it's the new normal. Successive governments have welcomed Russian oligarchs and their money with open arms.
Right from 2006, when Alexander Litvinenko was poisoned in London by Russian agents, the government should have been reassessing its view of Russia and the threat posed by it, said the committee, but instead pinned its hopes on resets and mutual business interests. Even the hacking of the Democratic National Committee in 2016 and circulation of material designed to damage Hillary Clinton's election campaign didn't prompt action, and the committee today decried confusion and lack of direction in the UK's cyber defences.
This is fundamentally about power and priorities and hard decisions, and Britain hasn't shown its willingness to do that yet. We still have dirty money flooding through the City of London and through our property market. We still have spies running riot from both China and from Russia, conducting influence operations, and we've not shown the willpower or determination or focus needed to deal with it.
The report doesn't blame Boris Johnson or the DG of MI5 or indeed the Cabinet Secretary personally. Rather, it paints a picture of systemic muddle in Whitehall, in not addressing the Russian threat seriously enough, and of ongoing problems, for example, in cyber operations where no one is clearly in charge. It hardly inspires confidence.
With the US Secretary of State in town today, the government faced questions about the Russia report and pushed back hard.
Russia is a top national security priority. We call out Russia when it's necessary. We've shown that in relation to the cyber attacks on research and development facilities in the US, the UK and Canada. We've done that together with our partners, and we are not for a second complacent about the threat Russia poses when it comes to cyber.
For many, it's clear this is not over. The intelligence agencies may not yet have looked systematically at Russian attempts to swing Brexit, but several members of the committee, and indeed its former chair, believe a new inquiry is necessary to do just that.
We need to understand, is it the case that in 2016 the Russians, for whatever reason, really decided that they were not going to try to influence or interfere with the referendum result? So this is an unusual example of them having done essentially nothing. Or is it that we've missed something, in which case we ought to know what they were doing to better protect us for the future? I do want to emphasise this. Nobody on the committee was talking about the issues in the referendum having to be reopened as a result of this, quite apart from anything else. What influence the Russians may have had over this, if they did interfere or try to interfere, is unquantifiable.
President Putin has long favoured assertive action, be that by the military or his intelligence services, in what he regards as Russia's interests. Today, leading UK parliamentarians have argued that must be acknowledged and more effectively countered if the two countries are to find new ways to coexist better.
Well, that was Mark Urban, and joining us now, first of all, Kevin Jones, the Labour MP and member of the ISC, the committee, who helped write this report. Kevin, you heard the Foreign Secretary there categorically denying that they'd avoided looking for evidence and saying they do call out Russia. Your response?
Well, I'd draw him to page, I think it's 13 of the report, paragraph 44, where the written evidence which we received from the government says that they didn't see interference in the elections. More importantly, they hadn't sought it.
they've rejected your call to open an inquiry into meddling in the Brexit vote. Do you believe there was meddling?
No, we were looking at the systems in place and seeing if there was a counter to any type of interference in that election. What shocked us was the fact that no one had taken responsibility and not even looked for interference in that election, other elections, even when there were clear indicators of influence being put in, for example, the post-Scottish referendum election and the Democratic Convention hack and leak.
Well, don't forget the Democratic Convention came after the Brexit
yeah.
vote. So who should have initiated that search then? When you say no one looked, where would that have come from?
Well, that's the problem. I think we described the area of responsibility. It was like a very complex wire diagram. And one of the recommendations is what is needed is that it needs to be brought under the Security and Counter-Terrorism Department and in a policy terms and in terms of operational role, MI5, to look at securing elections.
So was it just that each side thought the other was doing it and didn't question whether they were or not? I mean, is it something as simple as a sort of systemic mix-up in this?
No, I think there's two things. I think there is genuine confusion, and I think that needs to be put right. But also, I don't think politicians asked the questions.
Why not?
Well, you'll have to ask them, but they.
I mean, why do you think that they didn't? Why?
Well, I think we used the term in the report that people thought it was a hot potato that no one wanted to deal with.
Because they didn't want to offend Russia, or because they didn't want to look too closely at what had happened here, or they didn't want to feel that there were holes in what they'd done already?
Well, I think internal politics, possibly the Conservative Party, had more to play on that. But what we found was quite shocking.
You submitted this report, I think it was October the 17th last year. Is it clearer to you now why this was made public just one day before summer recess?
No, because what shocked me is the way in which Number 10 has tried to mislead. They said that the Prime Minister only had 6 days to read this report. Not true. They then said it needed 6 weeks to get its confirmation. That's not true either. They then said it needed to go around for more work on. That's not true. And then they tried to rubbish the entire process, and that's not true either. So I'm not sure why they put this misinformation out.
But would you say, given the build-up, that there is no smoking gun, there is no name or no finger pointed or no moment missed that proves definitely that there was Russian interference in our democratic system, is there?
No, but I think the very serious thing here is that we haven't got the systems in place. No one looked for that. And can I just stress the point about Brexit? We made it very clear in the report is even if you could actually prove interference, to quantify what that effect would have been very difficult. So Dominic Grieve is right in terms of when people say this was about Brexit, this report, it was nothing of the sort.
You probably saw a very different report. You submitted a very different report to the one we've read in terms of what's been redacted. Will we ever learn what was underneath all those asterisks and stars? I mean, are you expecting that to come out in a subsequent annex or publication?
No, there's this report with redactions. Then there's an annex to the report which is highly classified, and I can't discuss that, and it will not be made public.
But it's significantly different.
There are things in that, but I'm not going to discuss it because it would damage our national security.
Do you think this report would have been made public? I mean, it was a week ago, last Wednesday, that we saw that the new chair of your committee take over. It wasn't, as expected, Chris Grayling, it was Julian Lewis. Are you confident we would have seen this report anyway if Chris Grayling had been the chair?
Well, I was determined that this report came out. Others were as well.
So it doesn't matter who was actually at the head in that sense?
Well, the point is, it's the government that's politicised the issue around the chair of the ISC, which is contrary to the Act of Parliament that was agreed to in 2013, which said the Prime Minister should play no role in appointing the chair of the ISC.
Kevin Jones, thank you very much indeed. So are we any closer to understanding why there was a 9-month delay to seeing the Russia report and what was gained by the procrastination? Tonight, Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab told the BBC he categorically rejected the claim that the UK government had actively avoided looking for evidence of interference as the government turned down the committee's call for full assessment of any Russian meddling in the EU referendum. Nick, what is here? Just talk us through, first of all, the government response, Nick, and what we've heard.
Well, at one level, ministers feel vindicated that there's no smoking gun in this report report that shows that ministers have behaved in the wrong way. But at another level, ministers have, and the government has struggled today to give a concrete answer to that big question of the day, which is the finding by the report that there was, why was there no investigation into what the report described as widespread allegations of Russian interference in the Brexit referendum. And the government briefings today, they slightly went round in circles. So they pointed to the government response to the report, which said that there was no evidence of successful Russian interference in the referendum. Then the government said that the intelligence agencies do regular assessments of hostile state activities, and if new information emerges, then they decide whether to publish that. And in light of that, the government's view was there's no need for a retrospective assessment of that referendum. And then you say to them, well, how about a proactive investigation into that? And then you go round in circles with that answer. I have to say that cabinet ministers are a bit defensive today about their overall approach to Russia. They were very keen to point out that Dominic Raab recently announced the new Magnitsky sanctions against 25 named Russian individuals. And one cabinet minister said to me, we're not asleep at the wheel. The car is moving forward.
What about Labour, Nick? What are they planning for tomorrow?
Well, we're going to see a very different Labour Party tomorrow. You'll remember that after the Salisbury poisoning, Jeremy Corbyn demanded incontrovertible evidence of Russian involvement, and then he suggested sending the Novichok nerve agent to Moscow for them to take a look at it. Tomorrow, Nick Thomas-Symonds, who's the Shadow Home Secretary, he's going to be calling James Brokenshire, the Security Minister, into the House of Commons, an urgent question. And Nick Thomas-Symonds is saying this report exposes deep systemic failings in the government's approach to security.
Nick, thanks very much indeed. Well, in a moment, we'll be speaking to Anne Applebaum, staff writer at The Atlantic, who advised the ISC inquiry and who's written about the twilight of democracy, and the Conservative MP Bob Seeley, member of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. But we start, first of all, with Sir David Omond, who has held numerous senior security roles in government, including Director of GCHQ and UK Security and Intelligence Coordinator. Sir David, this report shows what I suppose you'd call a stunning lack of curiosity from the intelligence agency, who are meant to be finding things out.
There's a striking contrast, isn't there, between the clear determination of the National Security Council to see aggressive Russian activity in Ukraine, in Syria, in cyber attacks on the United Kingdom, and as you say, this apparent lack of interest in Russian subversive activity, digital subversive activity against our democracy. The report should have been published in early November. Had it been, it would have been even more useful than it is now, since we now have the government admitting that after extensive examination, there was Russian interference in the 2019 election, and that makes it really all the more regrettable that there hasn't been the sort of examination of the referendum that, say, the United States conducted into the 2016. Now,
I wonder how you explain it from the perspective then of the security roles that you yourself have held. MI5 was asked directly for information about Russian interference into the referendum, and they apparently provided just 6 lines of text. Doesn't that shock you?
Well, they hadn't investigated. Did they see that as part of their role? They were clearly preoccupied with counterterrorism, and the report is very clear about the pressures that task placed on them. But let's be clear: if the government had turned to its national security advisor and said, "We want a full investigation of whether there is or has been any Russian subversive activity of that kind," they would have had that inquiry. So
but
I think
shouldn't the buck stop with the intelligence agencies? I mean, it is.
No,
it's the job, isn't it?
The buck stops with the government we elect to look after our interests. The intelligence and security agencies follow the priorities of their customers. The security service has a specific responsibility to look out for threats, and they indeed have been busy chasing Russian spies. And
OK, let me bring just bring in Bob Seeley on exactly that point then. Evening, Bob Seeley. The accusation tonight is that the government actively avoided looking for evidence of Russian interference, and you've heard it there directly from a former head of GCHQ. The buck should stop with the government. The government decides what they should be looking at.
I think with the use of hindsight, it's not great. I would just say, on the debate about Brexit, I think I understand why the media is going for this, but I do think it's just rehashing a rather stale debate about Brexit.
Hang on a second. You're having a totally different debate. The media is not having that debate. You heard it raised by the ISC, who called for an inquiry to be opened, which the government has shut down. I just want to stop that because I don't think the media is talking about a Brexit referendum. We are looking at the calls from the committee, and the reason we're looking at it is because there was absolutely no curiosity on the part of your government, successive governments, to actually find out what went on. Now that's a dereliction of duty to the public.
The lack of protection in the Scottish referendum and the lack of protection and care in the Brexit referendum were both wrong. With the use of hindsight, it's easy to say that, but to be fair, it should have been said at the time.
OK, but don't talk about hindsight. If the committee's published its report today and they're saying you have the advantage now of correcting that, if you want, by looking into it, there is no...
Okay, the point I'm trying to make is that we've left the European Union. We can go back and have a look at it.
I don't think anyone's debating that.
Let me just finish the point. We can go back and have a look at whether something happened there, and I'm not opposed to that. I just think there are far more serious things now, actively, that we should be considering. An Espionage Act, a Foreign Lobbying Act, all the things that need to be done that will actually have resonance and purpose now, rather than going back and looking over the past.
Isn't the question a more fundamental one, which was if Russia considers the UK one of its top targets, which you've been told, and it has sought to influence campaigns from the Scotland referendum onwards, and we know what happened at the DNC in Philadelphia in 2016.
Yeah. For which people are being charged, for which the Americans are trying to prosecute people, absolutely.
But the point is, how can you champion democracy? How can you set us, hand on heart, apart from authoritarian regimes like China, and you've sat here before and talked about China or Russia, when we are in the position of not taking care of our own democratic process enough?
I think it's a failing. There is no two ways about it, but we need to learn from that. There are a bunch of things that we should be doing, like FOLO, like the Espionage Act, like actually having a proper... Back in the Cold War in the 1980s, and Professor Applebaum may remember some of this stuff, we had the Active Measures Working Group in the United States, a really important body, cross-government, was set up to understand and explain and expose Russian subversive activity, so disinformation, smears, blackmail. We need to be doing that again with the new forms of sort of hybrid war that both the Russians are doing via proxies and oligarchs and the smears and the disinformation, but also the things that other one-party states like China are doing as well, using economic and energy and united front.
Well, let me
there's lots of work to be done there.
Let me bring in Anne Applebaum. Do you believe that Britain is a safer place tonight for what we know?
I'm really glad to see, finally, a senior UK body laying out, actually, topic by topic, disinformation, cyber warfare, espionage, money in politics, all of the multiple ways in which Russia has tried to manipulate political debate, by the way, not just during elections, but in between elections, and more generally seeking to shape public and political opinion in this country for the benefit of Russia for a variety of reasons. And so in that sense, yes, I was really pleased by the report. It was franker than I had expected. It was less boring than I expected. And it really laid out what the structure of Russian policy towards Britain is. And yes, I think the recognition of that is going to be very useful going forward.
And you've looked into election meddling all over the world. How do you think our response has compared?
So I think it's true, as the previous speakers have said, that Britain took this way too lightly, way too long. Look, Russian election meddling, by which, by the way, we mean we mean many things. We mean use of money in politics. We mean bribing politicians. We mean sometimes supporting political parties. We also mean the use of disinformation and trolls and the famous fake websites. This is something that Russia does everywhere. I mean, in every country in Europe, in the United States, sometimes seriously, sometimes unseriously. Sometimes it's a little bit like throwing things against the wall to see what will stick. And sometimes it's a bit more careful and researched.
So, David, let me just
the British idea that, it's not, doesn't bother us, can't hurt our democracy, it's so old, was very naive and always has been.
Can I go back to you, Sir David? Bob Seeley's just said, in retrospect, there were failings. We can see where those were. Would you say the same for the intelligence services, that there was a reluctance, a nervousness almost, to get involved in anything that looked like the democratic process, even though it should have been about safeguarding democracy itself?
I think it's been a learning process, hasn't it? Because the starting position is the intelligence agencies would and should stay well away from any domestic interference in the electoral process, in the democratic process. They would be very nervous indeed of being portrayed as being too intrusive in looking into how electoral systems have been working. That attitude has changed. We've seen the National Cybersecurity Centre, for example, briefing the political parties on how to keep themselves safe from cyber attack. Very necessary after the experience of the Democratic National Committee in the United States. So I think it has been a learning process. I also think that
I'm just going to bring in Bob Seeley.
I think it's right on 3 points.
Credit.
Firstly, we know that GCHQ only started looking seriously at state activity, state rivals and state enemies, really from about 2014, 2015 onwards, because it was so focused on ISIS and other things. So, it's not a mistake, but that's an explainer. Secondly, if anything, MI5 needs to be much clearer. If it has concerns, if it finds bad things happening, just because it's happening in the political world, that is not a reason for not telling its masters. And thirdly, the reason I'm a bit sensitive of criticising this government is not because this government's around now and I'm here to support it, but because I think Dominic Raab is right when he says things are changing. This report was written a year ago, but actually the Cold War started, Putin declared the new Cold War at the Munich conference speech back in February 2007. And so really the complacency has been from 2007 through really to maybe a year, 2 years ago, when we started really being forced to be real about the threat from Russia.
That's a long time to have sort of missed the boat, as it were, Sir David.
The Russian activity, if you take the example of Crimea, has been a focus of British and Allied intelligence activity. Likewise, Syria, likewise, Ukraine, Russian activity around the world.
Yes, it's quite recent.
These have been priorities for British intelligence. The bit that's been missing has been the Russian attempts to interfere with or disequilibrate the democratic system.
Let me bring in Anne.
We've been slow to pick up on the big transformation that the digital world has given in the ease in which subversive activity can be conducted online. I've been writing about this for years.
I just want to bring in Anne Applebaum, because it's not just about the cyber and the security attacks. It's a very wide-reaching report in the sense it talks about Londongrad, elites allowing Russians to penetrate, Russian donors to the political system. Again, it suggests the sort of interweaving without anyone sort of noticing or caring.
Yeah, this is the part of the report, by the way, that could be dealt with almost immediately, and this is the money laundering that goes through London, the teams. I mean, the report talks about the accountants, the bankers, the lawyers who facilitate money laundering and who help create tax havens abroad. I mean, and by the way, this is money that doesn't just distort British politics. It also distorts the property market in London and outside of London. It may well be distorting business in the UK.
So when you say dealt with right away, what are you saying? How do you stop the dirty money tomorrow?
I mean, you could end tax havens tomorrow. I mean, tax havens aren't created by God. I mean, they're created by a legal system, and they could be eliminated. You could create a system of I think Bob Seeley mentioned lobbyist registrations. I mean, you could put transparency and clarity on all kinds of procedures that now take place in the dark. You could end the practice of owning property in Britain via secret shell companies, and we could make it illegal to own a piece of property without revealing who the owner is. Why not?
When you look around the world now, and Bob Seeley and I have sat here and discussed China and Hong Kong. Tonight we're discussing Russia. Clearly we've left the EU. Is it obvious who our friends are now, or do you think we are more isolated? For whatever reason, we are more alone.
So, the cure for being or feeling alone is to find allies. And you will find in Europe, and eventually, I hope, in the United States, other countries who care about the rule of law, other countries who want to stop these huge sums of money swirling around the world and ending up in politics. You will find them, as I said, mostly on the European continent. You will, perhaps in North America. And maybe it's time for Britain to start creating new alliances and new organizations to deal with these really crucial and key 21st century problems. Yes, you have lost quite a lot of allies in the last several years, but it's time to create new ones.
Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you, and thanks for coming in.